Welcome to Truths, the podcast where love for Torah, Israel, the Jewish people, and God meets fearless critical inquiry. Through powerful conversations and thought-provoking solo teachings, we explore how timeless Jewish wisdom can ignite 21st century meaning, drive personal transformation, deepen our connection to God and to one another, and inspire bold action to heal our world. Here's your host, Rabbi Dr. Levi Brackman.
It's been about a year ago or so that I sat down the first time with Rabbi Yehuda Ber Zirkind for our first full-length conversation in New Haven. That episode stirred more than a few passionate responses and some controversy. On my recent trip to Israel, I traveled to Jerusalem to sit with him again, this time in his own home, to continue our exploration of faith, doubt, and the quest for meaning. This season is titled Seeking Ecstasy, because I believe that the deepest truths often emerge at the edge of our certainty. In this conversation, Yehuda Ber and I dive into what Jewish theology really means, not as a fixed set of doctrines, but as a living, breathing conversation about how we relate to God, to tradition, and to one another. In the conversation, we discuss whether true knowledge of the divine is even possible, how our own experiences shape our beliefs, and what it looks like to live a holy life in an age of doubt and secularism. A few words about who Rabbi Yehuda Ber Zirkind is. Yehuda Ber is a senior research fellow at the Hasidic Research Institute of Herzog College and the David Cardozo Academy in Jerusalem, and a graduate student in Yiddish literature at Tel Aviv University. He studied at various Chabad yeshivas, and today lectures and writes on contemporary Jewish thought, Yiddish and Hebrew literature, Hasidism, Yiddish music and folklore, and Judaic bibliography. His forthcoming thesis is titled The Sacred, the Secular, and the Sacrilegious in the Life and Literary Works of Chaim. So pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee or any other drink, and join us as we weave together philosophy, personal story, and perhaps a little bit of controversy. So now let us begin our conversation. It's good to be here in Jerusalem with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Last time
Real pleasure.
Last time we had this recorded conversation, it was in Connecticut in the United States. People ask me, what brings you here? And I feel like I don't need an excuse to come to Israel as a Jew. But I'm also doing a new season of the podcast, and it is being titled Seeking Ecstasy. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And let's see how we can weave Seeking Ecstasy into this conversation.
Right.
I want to talk about Jewish theology and narrow it down to like a personal Jewish theology. So tell me about some of your thoughts on Jewish theology.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's important to mention just from the very outset that people talk about Jewish theology. And the truth of the matter is there are many Jewish theologies. Mm-hmm. There's more than one Jewish theology.
Should we define theology first, so we know what we're talking about?
I think that is a very, very good question, because sometimes theology, spirituality, psychology, anthropology, and all kinds of G's can get woven into the mix. So I think it is essential to define our terms. And sometimes I would say that the endeavor of Jewish theology, the quest for Jewish theology, is engaging in that question. In other words, it could be that we don't have our terms fixed when entering the conversation. And part of the conversation is trying to figure out the different strands that are woven within the enterprise called Jewish theology. So I feel that anthropology, peoplehood, spirituality, existentialism, all these psychology could all be part of Jewish theology. But what I would say for me, what Jewish theology is primarily a discussion about God or the divine and religion. How does my life relate in the broadest terms possible to the notion of God, divinity, religion, and part of today's discussion, I mean, the contemporary discussion of theology revolves around the question of, do we know anything about God, anything metaphysical? And that is an issue I grapple with a lot. And the question is, can there be a Jewish theology when in doubt, when being agnostic, when questioning, when being uncertain?
Mm-hmm.
And can the discussion about Jewish theology be richer when we don't have all the answers, when we're not peddling fixed dogmas? That's very much my approach to it, my entry point, if you will.
Okay, so when you say you don't know, define knowledge. What do you mean know? Because can anyone really know something which is metaphysical?
Well, I think again, every person is situationally fixed, meaning whatever we talk about is relative or in relation to who we are, where we're coming from, where we're going. So we don't live in a vacuum. We're born in a vacuum. And for me personally, growing up as an Orthodox Jew and being very much in the fold for many years, there is a certain belief and trust in what we call the Messiah, the tradition, the theological package that we're taught. And that is almost taken as a self-evident truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
And so is that the knowledge that we're talking about here?
That
one is doubting, or?
Yes, for me at least. For me, the knowledge is not a first-hand knowledge, because I don't have the hubris to say that I know anything firsthand about God or the divine, that I can be sure of God's existence or not, or of anything else. I have my own experience that I might interpret in light of certain beliefs. I have strong religious impulses, but there's a difference between a religious sensibility, a religious impulse, and saying we know. I think we have to be cognizant, and I think the word is acknowledge that we're living in a very, very strong age of secularization and doubt, especially about the metaphysical. So the question is, what does it mean to be religious? What does it mean to seek the divine in an age where I can't just work off dogmas that I accept blindly, blind faith, or there are those that are really convinced, but that's not my experience. So I'm not coming from a place where I have real concrete knowledge that I can be certain of. Definitely not mathematical knowledge, like anything near 2 + 2 = 4. And anything of that sort. It is more of a spiritual orientation to life. And the question is, and I want to broaden the conversation both for those that are more greater believers, meaning that they're more inclined to belief in God, more inclined towards accepting, let's say for Jews, the 13 principles of faith as articulated by the Rambam, by Maimonides, but also for those that may be agnostic, for those that may even be atheists, for people that doubt. Is there anything about divinity, or call it the quest for transcendence, that can somehow be loosely titled theology, in the sense of what I think is really the essence of religion? I'm right away giving an answer on a certain level, as I think really the essence of religion, at least for me, is the quest for transcendence. The quest for transcendence, whether or not that transcendence is reaching a deity, a God, which is beyond the world as a real entity, ontological being outside the world, imagined as a being that is a personal God, even who has will, who can command, who can create. Or for some people who may be skeptical of that, a transcendental element of reality, a higher order of being, what we might use a word chaye olam versus chaye shah, eternal life, the true nature of being, ultimate reality, as opposed to fleeting reality or day-to-day concerns. And I think right away, I think that for me, the struggle of living a religious life, broadly defined as how to sanctify life, and we'll get to that soon, but also differentiating between the kodesh and chol, the holy and the mundane. We use the word profane, but the mundane. And we can talk a little bit more about that as well. In general, in terms of Jewish theology, there has been a narrative arc, if you will, like the literature, a trajectory, a process of learning, understanding, changing my mind on different ideas, and growing up in the Frum world, the Orthodox world, the Chabad world, has given me a certain vision of theology, which is focused very much on what's called religious obedience, conformity, piety in conformity, and accepting the package that I was taught as a kind of, sorry to use that word, gospel truth. This is the truth, and there is a Jewish theology, and not only is there a Jewish theology, but the Jewish theology is of cosmic significance, meaning not only did I grow up with one view or one version of what truth about God, about divinity is all about, but I was taught to believe that there's a particular doctrine about life which is God's blueprint for the world. And one could call that a very fundamentalist view. That we know what God wants, we know what God's purpose in creation is, we are cosmic players, and that is very empowering on some level, because if you are part of the grandest game to ever take place, then of course you feel buoyed by that sense of mission, and you essentially become a missionary. You try to convert other people to that truth.
But do you think that in the beginning, let's go all the way to the beginning of the Bereshis, God created man in his image. Was that not some kind of, we're cosmic people now. If we're all created in God's image in some way, are we not cosmic people? Is that a theology which you were brought up with, or is that a biblical Jewish theology?
I think it is a biblical Jewish theology. I think the image of we are created in God's image is something which is a very, very profound religious idea. The question, though, is, do I take that particular picture, that particular image, as the be-all and end-all of the entire purpose and plan and master plan of creation? Growing up in Chabad with the belief of Dira B'Tachtonim, of that God, the expression of the Saba Kodesh Baruch Hu, Lias Lo Yisborach Dira B'Tachtonim, God desired that he should have a dwelling place in the physical world.
Comes from a medrash somewhere, right?
It comes from a medrash, right? Correct. I don't know if it's Tanchuma Vayakel or if I'm mistaken. Forgive me, but the idea being,
because in the Zohar it gives a different reason.
And that was, if you want, some of my earliest heretical thoughts, where I read and learned that the Ramchal, based on other Kabbalistic sources, gives another reason for the creation of the world. God's nature is to be good. So God wants to be benevolent and beneficent and give humans, bestow upon them his bounty. And that is why he set up a whole system of Torah mitzvahs and all that. What I'm trying to say is that I grew up with a very, very clear, but also fundamentalist, in the sense that this is the fundamental truth. And we know exactly what we're doing, why we're doing it. And that's why, by the way, I believe that Lubavitch is where I come from. Why they're so successful. Because they believe that going out there, I don't know, in India or in China or in Idaho, Montana, wherever it is, and spreading, again, using that, spreading the message that is relevant, that is fulfilling the cosmic purpose, God's master plan. So there's something very comforting, but for somebody who starts doubting, they don't have that certainty anymore.
Yeah.
And a theology is a small t, not the Jewish theology, not the master plan of creation. And I guess a lot of things where I differ, and this is what I'm going to get into, where I differ is that I was taught that the Torah is the God's blueprint for creation, God's guidebook, playbook for his purpose in creation. And that's very much the Frum worldview. Today, I look at the Torah as a guide for life. As a Jewish person, I learn from the Torah, and I deem the Torah as a sacred and essential to my religion. But I'm less certain about knowing for sure this represents God's master plan for
So what theology does the Torah suggest to you?
So, first of all, I think that it would be correct to point out that the way I see it now, coming from a more, critical academic approach, not critical in criticizing, but evaluating carefully, there's more than one theology in the Torah. And as I heard from a young Bible scholar by the name of Dr. Ariel Sari Levi, he says that the Torah is the first book of Machshevet Yisrael.
Right.
Torah itself is a book on Jewish thought. In other words, in the mainstream Orthodox conception, if one views the Torah as God revealing his definitive truth, so it is not a book about Jewish thought. This is God revealing himself. God is telling him the truth about life. It's like this is the DNA, the spiritual DNA code about life.
Yeah.
It is not a reflection about life. This is actually telling you the DNA of life.
Yeah.
But in my conception now, to me, it makes more sense that the Torah may have been divinely inspired, but that they also reflect different human conceptions of the divine and the human quest for the divine. And most importantly for me, this is the book of my people. But there's also an inherent pluralism in that book. The same way we have Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in the Gemara.
Yeah.
We also have, I would argue, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in Chumash. So for example, we're talking about these Parshias and Sefer Vayikra, Chumash Vayikra, talks a lot about the temple. So the question is, what is the temple? Is the temple more like God's palace or the White House, where the president lives? Is it literally God's abode? Or literally, whenever we say literally, we always say kvayachol, as it were, but still, very much a anthropomorphic image of God's dwelling place, and therefore you have to, es karbani lachmi l'ishai, God has to be given his bread. There is a certain energy, electricity that is surging through the mikdash that cannot be defiled. And if you come too close and you're not wearing protective gear, you're going to be zapped. A very dynamic, real, electrically charged sense of holiness, as if one were in the White House and the president is going around, and you have to make sure every move you make is not going to disturb the president or the king in the palace. Or is it more like the embassy? And I think an embassy, which is not the literal dwelling place of the king, but it's more of a representation or a physical, a concrete symbol of the king's sovereignty and rulership. So I think, for example, in the Varim, it uses the expression, God will dwell or place, there's another expression, lasum, to place his name there. So it's more like this is the place which is God's address or a symbol of his presence for people to interface with him, like an embassy, but not that this is literally the house of God, and that if you walk in, you'll be zapped. It's a different conception. In Devarim, it also says at the end of Devarim that the person who brings the Bikurim and Vidui Meiser, and he says, "Hashkifa mim oin kachecha min hashamayim." look from your dwelling place, your holy dwelling place, from the heavens.
Yeah.
And he says this in the temple, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Meaning that while, even though it is called the house of Hashem, but it's like an embassy. Hashem's real dwelling place is above. What he has below is like an ambassador. Like an ambassador, which is a delegation or a representation of the divine. So I'm just pointing out there are different theologies, and I do feel that one of the strong aspects of Jewish theology is the theology of Kedusha. The idea of holiness, Kedoshim Tiyu, that one should be holy.
So holiness is defined as?
Holiness is a vague term, admittedly, and it can mean many different things, and different people, different commentators have meant different things, but I think that your question before about the difference between the scholarly approach and personal is relevant and useful here, because on a personal level, I think for me, Kedusha means trying to live a more noble life, trying to live a life which is more in consonance with the divine, which means being holy, being more moral, being more ethical, being preoccupied with noble causes, which I would term Chaye Olam, meaning there's a difference between Chaye Sha'ah, which is temporal matters, and Chaye Olam, eternal matters. V'Chaye Olam nota b'seichenu. God implanted in us the Chaye Olam, eternal life. And I think what it means by that, the way I take it, is on a personal level. That whereas, let's say, other creatures don't necessarily have a concept of a eternal truth or eternal values that transcend their being, and everything is more of a means to an end to enable their own life. An animal has instincts for self-preservation and self-survival. So we can also work in that mode of Chaye Shah, the temporal life, meeting the needs of the moment. But then there's also a higher dimension, which is Chaye Olam, which is acknowledging that there's a higher plane of existence which is eternal. There are values that are eternal. Justice, kindness, truth are eternal values.
Yeah.
They're not contingent upon my life.
So when we talk about theology literally means the
study of God,
right?
Divinity, right?
Yeah. So how is this which you described, to summarize, the need for holiness, ethical, moral holiness is what you're describing, and this idea of preoccupation with Chaye Olam, which is more of a transcendent concerns rather than the mundane physical concerns, which we call Chaye Shah. How does that relate to the study of God, theology? And the other follow-up question which I have for you is, what are the influences? You spoke a lot about your upbringing, what used to be, and now here we're talking about what it is now, correct? The way you see it now.
Right.
So you've come to this new formulation of a theology, a personal theology, which is why very often there's any number of people I could sit down with, I've been asking their theology, and they will just basically parrot fashion something they read in a book somewhere, or they heard at a shir somewhere,
right.
Which is a lot less interesting for me sitting here having these conversations for the Seeking Ecstasy season of the podcast, because you can look up those books, whereas you've come to this differently from a much more thoughtful perspective. So the follow-up is like, how did you get from what it wasn't to what it is?
Okay, for me, although I don't want to be arrogant and say, what isn't, I feel...
Or what isn't for you.
Today, where I've maybe grown, matured, thought about, maybe some will think regress, but I feel progress, not regress. So first of all, the idea of holiness as related to God, I think, is rooted in the parsha that we just read last week. Today is Sunday, Parshas Emor, but this Shabbos, yesterday, Achrei Mois Kedoshim Tiru, right? Kedoshim Hashem Elokecha, and be holy because I am holy. And one of the interpretations is known as imitatio Dei, imitating the divine. And the Chazal say that you go in the ways of God. Just as God is holy, so too you be holy. So if we translate it based on the interpretation we gave before, what it means is that I move away from my corporeality, from my body, from my temporal human needs, and I plug into a higher realm of existence, which is the divine existence, true existence. And that can mean different things. But for our purpose right now, what it means is God is on a holier level, represents morality, some degree of perfection, but I don't want to confuse that with the medieval concept of perfection. There is an Aristotelian concept of God being perfect. I don't want to get into that. Here's more perfect in action or representing nobility, a kind of moral perfection.
So why do you want to imitate God? Is that because it says in the Torah, or there's a...
So, first of all, I think as a human being, we all have a need for self-transcendence.
Yeah.
If life is just about, if we are the end, there's no higher end, then we're in a really bemoanful state. Because if the buck ends with us, then really the question is, why go through it all?
The reductionist, physicalist kind of perspective.
Yeah.
There's nothing more than...
And not only that, if life is only self-serving, if what I call is, if we believe in self-theism as an ideology, that all there is to life is the self-aggrandizement, and we live also in a consumerist world where everything is about consumption and about commodities that satisfy our needs and our interests of consumption. And life is all about, and also marketing is about creating an imaginary need, and creating that need will mean that there's a consumer who's going to buy it, so the company is going to make more money, but it's a kind of philosophy of life where what really we are here for instant gratification, for self-gratification. So I just think even on a human level, the quest for religion and spirituality is understanding that if the buck stops with us, if there's nothing greater than just enjoying life, so if we're going through a hard time, why go through life? If it is only about ourselves, then it's very, very empty. Whereas if we can understand that there's a level of meaning and purpose, or as JFK said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Meaning that there are higher ends, that I am in the service of higher ends. So then it even on a selfish level, it gives my life more meaning. I upgrade my own life from Chaye Shah to Chaye Olam. I upgrade my own life from just being...
So we're talking about God, so clearly God is a religious concept, right? Some people like William James would consider any kind of religious experience to be a deeply personal experience. And any kind of personal theology we're talking about is, by definition, religious. Would you agree with that? But if you have a personal theology, which you're living by, then that's by definition religious. In other words, can you have a theology for your life which isn't religious?
Well, I think that one could have that's a good question, because theos, I think, means a deity.
Right.
So technically, the definition of theology might preclude somebody who's a non-deist or doesn't have room for a God. However, I would argue that in a broader sense, one can be religious without believing in God. Because if religious means a propositional faith which is contingent on certain beliefs or on certain metaphysical facts, so then maybe an atheist or an agnostic cannot really be religious. Mm-hmm. But if religion is about a sensibility, if religion is about a sensitivity to the transcendence, and if religion is framed not necessarily as the quest to be obedient to God, or it is not about belief, what I believe or what I do in terms of religious conformity, but it is a quest to raise my life above the mundane dimension of existence to a higher and holier realm. Like, for example, I would argue that even an avowed atheist can also, an avowed atheist do have a sense of sacred. Sanctity.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you listen to Sam Harris and his wife, who just got her latest series, she's got a very, very interesting series on consciousness, and we should get an Audible, kind of an audio documentary on her quest to understand consciousness better. And both Sam and his wife are both meditators. And you can sense that they have a sense of the transcendent and what they call consciousness, or that deeper sense of self, which is not the exterior self. It's Chai Olam, not Chai Shah. So, but when I listen to them, I hear them talking about God, just not saying the name God. In other words, they're dancing around it. I think God's been given a bad name from the very sophomoric views that a lot of people have of what God is. Now, God, to most more sophisticated thinkers, God isn't this little old man sitting on a cloud with a long white beard.
Right.
Right.
That's the Santa Claus version of God.
Right. So the question is, this transcendence that you're talking about, how is that? Are we talking about God, or are we talking about something else?
The question is, how do you define God? Do you define God as a noun or an adjective? Meaning, is God a being, an ontological being? And I'm saying, I have my metaphysical questions. I have my doubts. I don't know one way or the other.
Yeah.
I don't have any conviction because, to be quite frank, because I don't have firsthand experience or definite experience of God. God did not reveal himself to me in such a way that I can be certain that the God of the Bible exists. I didn't have that. Rather, I had a certain trust in what we call the Messiah, which means a tradition. Mm-hmm. The tradition that I grew up with. Once I lost my trust in that tradition because there were all kinds of questions that made me question it. So all of a sudden, how do I know what the tradition tells me about God is true? Nevertheless, I am not readily going to dismiss, I'm not a reductionist who's going to readily dismiss all claims of God, like, oh, do you believe in a fairy, or the tooth fairy, or Bigfoot? There are a lot of atheists who use that example. Well, do you believe in a unicorn? Do you believe in UFOs? So why should I believe in God? Okay, I hear them. I understand. I can be skeptical as well. I do question. But first of all, it's a different, not only is it a different magnitude of it has more relevance, the question of God, than whether or not a unicorn exists or not, or whether demons exist. But also, I think that there's a bigger question, because the question of God really touches on ultimate reality.
Yeah.
Whereas the question of Bigfoot does not touch on ultimate reality. And I think whatever...
It's a more important question, yeah.
Yeah, and therefore, I am open. What I'm trying to say is, I think there is a notion of theology or religiosity that one could, in the most conspicuous or the most obvious sense, would be related to God as a deity. But also, if one looks at God, views God as an adjective, as a definition of reality, as a describer of reality, divine goodness. To be good is to be divine, the divinity in the universe, the dimension of the universe which inculcates meaning,
or which transcends the physical.
It transcends the physical, right? The things that we deem eternal. So then, yes, that there can be divinity as an adjective. And I think there are many people that, even if they did not believe in the supernatural deity and the ontological deity, they definitely had a sense of godliness as an adjective, as the godly dimension of reality. And therefore, what I'm trying to argue is that while 100% traditional Judaism or any traditional theistic religion, for that matter, is rooted in the belief in a deity, I think the concept of holiness, of transcendence, is not dependent solely on that conception of God.
We can gloss over whether God came down on Mount Sinai. No, let's not gloss over that, because that's a really, for the Jewish religion, that's a really important part of the theology, is that God descended upon Mount Sinai and spoke to man and gave them the Ten Commandments, and then, in a sense, betrothed the Jewish people. When you think about that, and you think about all the people who received revelation from God in the Torah,
right?
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all had these revelations. What was going on there, and what do they tell you? What does it tell you to you in your life? I mean, how do you view that?
So first of all, I wasn't there. I'm not privy to such an experience, to be quite honest. I'm not trying to be cynical and brush it. I'm just trying to be honest. Meaning, I believe, and I truly believe that those descriptions in the Torah are not fiction. They describe something.
Yeah.
What it is, I don't know. What exactly it is, because I wasn't there, ilu yadaita vayisef. It takes one to know one. I'm not one.
Yeah.
So therefore, I don't know one. Meaning, I don't know exactly what it's referring to. James Kugel, in his book, The Great Shift, deals a little bit with it. But I don't have that. I wasn't privy to that kind of revelation, so I don't know what that means. There can be moments of insight. There have been moments in my life where I felt that whatever is happening is being divinely orchestrated. In other words, there's a power beyond me that is taking hold of me, not in a vision or in possessing me in a spiritual way, but that there were times in my life that I felt that whatever was happening, although I thought I was making the plans, I was pulling the strings, really there was something else pulling the strings. One can call it God, one can call it fate, one can call it destiny, but that there was something higher, greater than me or beyond me that I was fitting into a larger script, and I wasn't the one who was writing that script.
Yeah.
I was a pawn maybe or a puppet in somebody else's.
Okay, so going back to
Yes.
to the theology and what one takes them from. So they weren't fiction, right? They represent something real. You just don't know what it actually represents.
And I definitely do feel that part of it, like you take the Yechezkel's vision of the Merkava and other, that they are describing what may be the theologian Rudolf Otto would call the numinous, the great power, the great power that is both fascinating and terrorizing. And in the Torah, there's this word used a lot, phrase kavod Hashem, and it describes that the kavod Hashem, the glory of Hashem, the mara of Hashem, the vision of Hashem is like eish eichla, like a burning fire. So there was an understanding that the divine glory is manifest as a real power, like the sun, for example. Mm-hmm. That the divine dimension is of enormous power, and that power does reveal is both impersonal and personal. It's transpersonal, it's greater than personal, but it's not less than personal. And for somebody who questions, so the question is, do I take this literally? Or can I take it in a direction of there is a greater force, there is a transcendence, there is the greater whole, which is pulling me to move away from my own ego. Or like this word that I heard from Professor Michael Fishbane of Ani Yeshena v'libi er kol doidi doifek, meaning the way literally it means I am asleep, my heart is awake, the voice of my beloved is knocking on the door, and he says, "Open up the door for me." He
from the Song of Songs.
From the Song of Songs. He interprets it in his book on Shir Hashirim, the JPS commentary, and also in his book Fragile Finitude, that Ani Yeshena, when the ego is asleep, then the libi, the heart, can be can be alert, can be awake to kol doidi doifek.
So is it possible that kol doidi doifek is happening the whole time?
Absolutely.
And
b'chol yom v'yom baskol yitzes mahar chaydav machlezes v'olam ablius malbeinu shel. Yeah.
Right. There's revelations which are going on the whole time, and if the ani is yeshena enough, the more you're going to experience that revelation.
Being attuned to the music of the cosmos. You know what it's like? It's like here you have a park right nearby. If I'm busy thinking or I'm listening to my music, I can't hear the chirping of the birds. Right. But if during the nighttime, when the buses are not humming and buzzing, then I can hear the chirping of the birds. Or in the morning, early morning. I'm usually there.
So then you do know what will happen there, perhaps.
I don't know exactly what happened there, but
there were enlightened people who were in tune with the cosmos.
I think that is part of it. I don't know.
Is that Chaya to you?
Or? I think part of the great, and this is part of Jewish mysticism, it's not necessarily biblical theology, but I definitely feel as a part of the Kabbalistic theology, is self-annihilation, bitul hayesh, where the ani morphs into the ayin. The I turns into the greater nothingness. And that nothingness is like the drop of the ocean that loses its individuality but becomes part of the whole ocean. So there is a sense where, to what extent am I focusing on I as a separate entity? And to what extent am I part of the great cosmic flow of life? I am part of, to what extent am I a particle that is separated from the light? Mm-hmm. And to what extent am I a particle or a wave, whatever you want to call it, a sliver of light myself? And I think part of it is tuning down the ego and dialing up the God, the higher energy, but particularly with the Torah. The language is still be holy, be a holy people, imitate God, be moral, don't hate your fellow, love your fellow as yourself, don't lie, don't cheat, don't do chamas, don't do violence, don't do evil. Because all that is seen as anti-God. That is the realm maybe of the demonic, the realm of Tumah, the realm of Sheol, of the underworld, the netherworld. There is, even in biblical theology, one can argue a separation between, I wouldn't say that they're two different beings, like in Zoroastrianism, a dualism between the good, bad God and the bad God. But there are enough intimations, even within Tanakh, of a conception of the kingdom, the realm of the other world, whether it's personified or not. But there is a realm of desolation that you have in Vayikra. You should not serve to the goats, to the demons. They serve to demons. There was an understanding that there was some kind of people worship to powers of destruction, the gods of destruction, and that the biblical God is the God of life, not the God of destruction. So part of Kedusha, very much of part of Kedusha is about life. But not only in the Hasidic, in Hasidic stories, there's a famous story of Rabbi Lepler, who came to the Alter Rebbe and he asked him for a bracha for Harichas Yavim, not the life of a peasant.
Yeah.
And I think that is really what Kedusha is, the life that we should live. One can live for a very long time, and every moment of it is only Chaye Shah. And then one can be Kainai Lamai B'Shah Achas. In other words, Kainai Lamai, one could be Kainai Chaye Olam by doing one deed in which the person transcends their mortality, or their very contingent reality, their limited reality, and they do something for humanity, for kindness, for justice, for goodness, for holiness, and which is a redemptive act. They do something heroic in which they're able to transcend who they... And sometimes that one moment, which makes the difference whether or not a person will be remembered for eternity or not.
That's that transformational moment that transforms their life. There's a lot of conversation around that. I know William James talks about it a lot. That you have this, you can have this one
religious conversion moment.
Yeah, exactly. Where all of a sudden you have this unitive experience where everything gets clear. People have this epiphany, and then something then changes. People who describe people who are addicts and other kinds of things before, all of a sudden they don't desire to drink anymore, and they've become just different people.
You see the light
in a moment.
Yeah, they saw the light and they convert.
So it's living more of a spiritual life. This is a very traditional kind of viewpoint, it sounds to me.
First of all, it is traditional in many ways. I'm not going to deny it. We'll talk about the more untraditional stuff in a moment. But there are different levels of you're taking it to seeking ecstasy, looking for some kind of supernatural or mystical experience. I think the holiness of the Torah is a very, pardon the expression, prosaic holiness, at least on a basic level. Sanctify yourself in the mundane reality. Yeah. Don't cheat, don't steal. It's not about meditating on a mountain and getting any deep insights into reality. It is taking part of Kedusha, and I think this is very much the biblical concept, is infusing Chayil with Kodesh. And now I'm going to get into the more critical.
On the one hand, first of all, the revelation of Sinai itself was nothing short of a mystical experience. But then you do have later where the Zirkind, Moshe and Aaron, another Rabbi on the Zirkind went up.
Right.
And they saw these visions.
Vayesu Elokim, Vayochlu Vayishtu, Tachas Raglov, right.
Kilibnas,
Saper Kesem Hashemayim L'Toya, right.
So, these were very mystical experiences that were happening. There certainly was some kind of mystical experience. So with the Torah, it's not just do's and don'ts. It's also...
No, 100%. And I would add, something that I can relate to in a very different way, but perhaps related, is I remember when I was 12 years old, I went to Vienna, and there's a place called Schloss Schönbrunn. The Schönbrunn Palace is where Franz Joseph's palace.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I first saw it, there's actually a observation point, or like on top of the hill when you can look down and see the entire estate. And I was just like, my mind wide open. I never saw such splendor in my life. It was an incredible moment. It's like the little child who discovers things for the first time. Like, I was wide open, gaping wide open, my mouth. And I would think that Moshe Rabbeinu, seeing that, let me see this great sight, Hasnei Nenu Ukal, or Yeshaya Kadosh 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 Hashem Savois Melech HaLa'aretz Kavoidai. Yes, that it was a visual experience of something very, very profound, something that Heschel would call ineffable, something tremendous. And seeing that vision of Lach Tachas Raglo Kamaisel, however we understand it, is what maybe Otto would call the numinous. You saw, like somebody who never saw the sun, and all of a sudden they see the sun. Wow! How did I know? Or in today's day and age, when you first discover AI, what AI can do, it is a discovery. It is an epiphany of sorts. Like, it changes your view. Some people call looking at planet Earth from outer space. I never did it, obviously. The overview effect.
They still have.
Yeah, there's still overview effect.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, there's a mystical experience of seeing a certain grandeur. That there was a certain grandeur, and Heschel talks a lot about that. His way of religiosity is cultivating a sense for the ineffable, radical amazement, awe, wonder, the grandeur of being. It could be, on a certain level, one can interpret visions in Tanakh in a similar way. I think the effect was similar. Right. Meaning they saw, I think the word is Moshe Rabbeinu is, I'm going to move. All of a sudden, I am shifting gears. I'm shifting consciousness. You have people that say their first psychedelic trips, I never had one. I never took any of them, but that was mind-altering for them. They saw a vision which completely changed the way they look at things. So yes, there is an element of ecstasy there, but I think for the Jewish tradition, Har Sinai, there was Hagbelas Ha'or V'Kidashta, again, sanctification, because of the great power, God's presence being revealed at Mount Sinai. But b'Mishoich HaYovel, after the revelation, see, Hema Yalu Bahar, you can go back up. What is the continuation of Maimed Har Sinai? Is the Mishkan.
Yeah.
And the Mishkan is very much about the holiness in the camp. So I think a good way to describe it, the biblical theology of holiness is the following way. Imagine our bodies. We have a heart, and the heart has to pump blood to all the different veins. What happens if we start eating stuff or doing things, not keeping our watching our health? And the arteries start being clogged. Mm-hmm. And essentially, what I see, the theology of holiness of the Torah, is that the desire is that blood flow, or that electrical current should suffuse all of reality. The Niktashti B'Soich B'nei Yisrael means that God's presence, holiness, should be manifest throughout all of Israel. Now, in the biblical conception, God's domain is not only the temple, but also the land of Israel. That's why if somebody clogs the arteries, if somebody does an Aveda, somebody defiles the temple and the sacred grounds, the estate of the king, the land is going to chase them out. Is going to literally vomit them. Why? The same way, if a virus starts coming, a healthy body is going to fight against it.
Yeah.
So essentially, the way I see the Torah, there is a fight, a struggle, a process between the forces of God, the forces of Kedusha, which is God going to be present? Life, holiness, beauty, meaning, in a broader sense, but is the Kedusha, the holiness of God, going to be manifest? Is the king, to use an example of the palace, is the king going to feel comfortable in his entire palace?
Yeah.
Or are we going to chase him away?
So this is biblical theology, based on the scholarship. In other words, this
Right.
isn't just Chazal.
This
It's
is not just
Mefarshim.
Chazal. It's not just Mefarshim.
Right. Seems to be what Teres Kohanim is saying.
Right. And I'll, for example, illustrate the difference, because one of the great Bible scholars on Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, was somebody by the name of Jacob Milgrom.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob Milgrom wrote a 3-volume massive commentary on Leviticus containing 2,700 pages. Now, Jacob Milgrom, he actually views the Pshutei Shel Mikra a little bit differently than Chazal. He argues, for example, that when it says in certain times, places in the Torah, that by you doing the sins, you are going to be contaminating the temple, it doesn't mean only, as Chazal would have it, only by entering the temple. He refers to it as the priestly portrait of Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray is a character from an Oscar Wilde novel or play. Again, I'm not familiar with the literature part of it so much, where he argues, where the image is that if Dorian Gray does something wrong, it won't be noticeable on him, but there's a portrait of him hidden somewhere else. And the more he does something wrong, the more it will affect his portrait. So Milgrom's argument is that the temple, the Mishkan, is the epicenter of God's vitality and energy. When somebody does an Aveira in the Machane, for example,
it interferes with it.
It casts pollution or radiation, is airborne, and it reaches the temple. And therefore, the karbanos that are brought, for example, the karban chatas, which we usually translate as a sin offering or an offering of atonement, or Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, which is seen as forgiving of sins, he actually says Kippurim comes lechaper, which also means to sanitize, to clean. Mm-hmm. And chatos, how do you say a disinfected in Hebrew, modern Hebrew? There's chomer chitui, mechateh, right? V'chitesa, you find that also in the Torah. V'chitesa, not you will sin, but you will purify. And he has the following theory, a very interesting theory, which illustrates this point. There are 3 different types of sacrifices to purify the temple. One chatos, one purification offering, the blood of it is daubed on the corners of the altar in the azara, or the animal sacrifice altar, which is in the courtyard, which is not in the holy, which is the lowest level. That is for sins that are perpetrated by individual Israelites, unwitting sins, b'shoigeg. A unwitting sin that was done by the Kohen HaMashiach, this is from Vayikra Perek Daled, by the Kohen HaMashiach or the entire congregation, that warrants an offering, a chatas pnim, that is actually the blood is daubed on the inner altar, the one which is already in the Kodesh. And finally, once a year, there is a karban chatas that the Kohen Gadol brings into the actual Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, to purify the inner sanctum, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, from the wanton sins, the brazen sins of the Israelites throughout the year. So the theory is that there is a, if you will, I don't use the word tug of war, but there are 2 opposing forces that are at play here. On the one hand, there is the force of holiness, and the closer to the sun you are, the more likely you are to get burnt, and therefore, a kohen gadol, this is a concept of graded holiness,
Yeah.
Somebody, in order to enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim, one has to be really holy, and that protects them against the dangerous, the high voltage, and therefore only the Kohen Gadol can go in. Somebody else, a stranger, will die. Somebody who's not the Kohen Gadol, the Zor that goes into the Kodesh. Then there's a lesser level of the Kohen. And the notion being that on the one hand, the more intense the holiness, like Chazal say, if a Kohen Gadol did not do his avodah in Yom Kippur properly, they would die.
Yeah.
But then there's a counter idea, which is that the forces of impurity, of tumah, can actually defile the temple. And in Yecheskel and Prakim Ches and Yud, there's this whole vision of the abominations of the Israelites as actually chasing God away from the temple, like clogging the arteries. That diagram of the priestly picture of portrait of Dorian Gray illustrates the concept of the greater sin is like a stronger bullet that can penetrate further.
Right.
That a wanton sin can penetrate into the Kodesh HaKadoshim.
And so in today's, where we don't have the tabernacle,
right,
and we're not bringing any sacrifices, this might be seen from a moral perspective, you're saying, and also somehow God resting His glory, the covenant which is rests on the Mishkan, and that by sinning that pushes it away. So in today's day and age, I mean, a similar kind of thing. If you want to have the glory, if you want to have connectivity, communion with the divine, then you have to make sure that you're pure, you're holy, you're acting in an ethical, moral way, but you're also not shooing God away. You're not called blocking the arteries, so to speak. Okay.
Mi Yala Bahar Hashem, who's going to ascend the mountain of God, the Ki Kapayim of our Levo, somebody who's clean of their actions.
So this would be, I think we hear clearly the differences, slight differences from the scholarly perspective versus the Mefarshim. But how do you personally take this?
In my personal life,
because you're a biblical scholar.
Well, that's my hobby.
Today, well, more than we haven't discussed it in this conversation.
Yeah.
But we have discussed how biblical scholarship with the documentary hypothesis is something which you've been convinced about.
A version of the composite authorship of the Torah, as opposed to the strict model known as the documentary hypothesis. But okay.
And
I also want to take it on a personal level. Go ahead.
Yeah. So even someone who studies that can still look at the Torah, take this and say, okay, I can take this to my life and live it. In other words, having the documentary hypothesis in your life doesn't preclude taking these teachings, these truths to one's lives as a
guide for life in many ways.
Yeah.
Even if one doesn't believe them as being necessarily, they have to be an infallible truth that can never be reinterpreted, if you will.
Yeah.
So on a personal level, I think an example that more people can relate to today, and this is apropos our current parsha of Emor, where there are clear distinctions between a regular kohen and a kohen gadol. For example, a regular kohen is not allowed to defile himself, render himself impure to a corpse, to a dead body, but with the exception of 6 relatives, and a kohen gadol is not even allowed to do that. A kohen is allowed to marry a widow, but he's not allowed to marry a divorcee. The kohen gadol has to marry a virgin, according to this week's parsha. The idea, again, is graded holiness. But the way I would take it in today's day, for example, a question that people can relate to is, let's say, about vegetarianism. Mm-hmm. Vegetarianism is a certain ethical ideal, and Cook wrote a whole monograph called Chazon HaSimchonut VaShalom, the vision of vegetarianism, and he actually argues, and that's right, that before the flood, we weren't allowed to eat animal meat. So it's really a concession to human frailty, to human bloodlust, that we eat meat. So he believes that when Mashiach will come in the future, it will be a return to this vegetarian ideal. He even claims that the korbanos will also be vegetarian. Va'orva la'Hashem minchas Yehuda Ber Zirkind. A mincha is made of flour, is vegan, it's not animal. But what I'm trying to say is that I think on the one hand, there is a question, there's always that aspiration of increasing holiness. And that can also be on a moral level. Like maybe at one stage I will reach the point I'm not vegan or vegetarian, but maybe at one point I will be. Meaning, and also questioning, am I really on that level? Am I on that? Am I a kohen gadol? Am I a kohen? Now, or not? Am I on that level? Because sometimes, if we're not on that level and we take on holiness, then we can be a chassid shaita, then it can be misplaced, and it can even be destructive. Like Rav Kook says, if somebody's into animal rights and they don't care about human rights, it can be a travesty. So in that regard, now more importantly, and also talking a little bit more broadly about my own journey, I think where I differed a lot from my previous upbringing is Judaism can be defined in two ways. Judaism can be defined as a religion. Judaism, like Islam or Christianity, as a religion. And then there is Jewishness, being ethnicity, nationality, nationalism. In the world, in the frum world, Chabad world where I grew up, it was very clear that Judaism is defined by the religious definition of Judaism. In other words, if my Jewish ethnicity doesn't really matter in the greater scheme of things. What really matters is being a religious Jew, being God's chosen people, which is a religious concept. And following the laws with the conception that this is a book that was given to us by God and represents the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Very much that a Christian, you see, there's an interesting parallel to Christianity, because Christianity is a religion of faith and belief in dogma. If somebody doesn't believe in Jesus, so they can't call themselves a Christian. But somebody could be Jewish even if they're an atheist. So, but as far as one would argue,
how is that? Why is that?
Because we are a people, we are an ethnicity, we are a people, and it's not just
we're genetically Jewish. Genetically Jewish.
We're part of a people. We're part of genetically Jewish by a lot. Whatever it is, I don't want to get into all kinds of theories or whatever, but we are a people. We're not just a religion. Christianity may feel a sense of solidarity with other Christians, but in Islam, you also have the difference between being Arab and being Muslim.
Right, but they do have also this concept of the ummah.
The ummah, right? Which is the am, true. Right. But what I want to get at least as far as Judaism is concerned, because this is our topic, that I grew up very much with the mindset that what really matters is the religious principles of Judaism. If I don't believe the religious truth claims of Judaism, so then I'm just a secular person.
Yeah.
And I want to share an insight where I really had like a 180-degree turn on this, a shift. And I want to preface it with a statement that has really been, or vart that has been percolating in me, especially since October 7th. That's the vart that I heard in Yiddish. Right. If Jews do not make Kiddush, the non-Jews will make Havdalah. And the way I interpret it in a modern day idiom is the following. If Jews don't have a positive reason to be Jewish, based on a sense of sacredness, of sacred duty, of sanctifying their nationhood and their peoplehood, if we don't make Kiddush, if we're not Mekadosh ourselves, we don't sanctify ourselves, if we don't live up to the mission of being Mamlechas Kohen and the Goy Kaddish, so then we will be forced to be Jewish for a negative reason because of anti-Semitism, because the non-Jews will discriminate against us. So the question is, take your pick. Do I want to be Jewish today in a post-October 7th world because the non-Jews hate me, or some non-Jews hate me? I'm not saying all of them do. Because I am aware of the Havdalah in a negative sense? Or do I want to be Jewish because in the positive sense, I have a sense of being part of a holy nation? So going back to the shift that I had, this is the vart of living the nature of Jewish identity, not just based on the Holocaust as what causes Jewish identity and self-consciousness, but based on Sinai. Yeah. Knowing that we're Mamlechas Kohen and V'goy Kaddish. However we view Sinai, as a literal event, as a narrative in the Torah, as a concept, but that notion, The notion of Sinai, the tradition says that we become a nation of priests. And as Shadal, Shmuel David explains, the idea of Mamlechas Kohanim and Goy Kodesh means that the same way we're supposed to be like priests in other nations who are devoted to God and the temple, or to gods.
Not necessarily a monastic lifestyle, though.
Not necessarily a monastic lifestyle. And that is why I feel that living here in Israel especially makes me feel much more part of the Amcha, the peoplehood.
Yeah.
But I want to first...
So the shift.
What I want to get to the shift is one of the things that I've learned from Mordechai Kaplan, even though there are a lot of things I disagree with him about, but that notion of the centrality of Jewish peoplehood. In other words, that the reason, if I were to go with the old paradigm of I believe I am Jewish because I believe in the Maimonides' 13 principles of faith, I believe Judaism is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and all the other religions are false. So then if I question that, my relationship to Judaism would be very tenuous, because it's based on a metaphysical belief system, based on the veracity of certain religious truth claims. If, however, my religiosity is based on the understanding that we the people, like the preamble of the Constitution, meaning that we are, the Jewish religion is the religion of the Jewish people. Yisrael are koidmin lo'iraisa. Jews precede ontologically the Torah. The Torah is there for the Jewish people. Now, yes, the mission of the Jewish people is to bring God into the world, to bring holiness into the world. But if I understand, it's not a question of, I no longer adhere to the fundamentalist view that I know exactly why God created the entire universe. I know God's blueprint. I don't know. I remain agnostic about that. What I do know is that I'm a biological Jew, and I do know that part of the Jewish tradition, part of our self-concept, whether it was revealed by God on Mount Sinai, or whether this was a divinely revealed insight by a prophet who had an inner revelation of God, or even if it was made up, quote unquote, by Jews, my ancestors, who were seeking the divine, who were seeking that transcendent connection. And they viewed themselves, they came to believe themselves as bonim atem la'Hashem Elokeichem, as children to God, and as mamlechas kohanim v'goy kodesh. I think that remains the cornerstone. That should remain the cornerstone of Jewish identity, even of somebody who's totally secular. And I think that even today, even really secular Jews...
Which leads to like a very, very interesting paradox, if I may. Because what you're saying is, right, that... That
yeshiva, she grab a finger,
What you're saying, 1 second. What you're saying is, on the one hand, right, I don't need to believe that the Torah is necessarily
the truth,
capital
T.
Right. It didn't come from God necessarily, 100% dictated by God to Moses, etc. However, in this book, which came about somehow or other from our ancestors, it says that God came and he told us that we should be a Mamlechas Kohanim, therefore we should dedicate ourselves to God as the Mamlechas Kohanim v'Goy Kodesh. So in other words, you can start up with agnosticism about the veracity of the book or about the origins of the book.
Correct.
Right? But because this is our book, therefore now we're going to become religious people because the book tells us to become religious people. Do you see the somewhat?
Absolutely, it's not somewhat. It is a great paradox. But I would say that even if you take, let's say, a liberal Jewish notion of tikkun olam, even if there's some aspects of it that I think are downright dangerous and extreme, and especially in today's climate, I don't want to get into that. But at the heart of it, at the core, I'm not talking about the psoilos, about the waste byproduct of it, but at the core is a sense that we are supposed to be a light onto the nations.
Right.
And I think even the most secular Jew understands that what justifies their existence is tikkun olam, that we need to make the world better. We need to bring God into the world, however they understand divinity, make the world a better place. And and again,
so everyone gets to the same place in the end.
But let me broaden. Yes and no, because I think a religious person will focus more on the ritualistic mitzvahs, for example. kashrus, let's say, will be more important, let's say, than vegetarianism. Whose shechita it is will be more of a burning issue than whether or not we should be vegetarian.
Yeah.
The question of shatnas and a beged will be more important, let's say, than being honest in business and stuff like that, because that's more of an ethical mitzvah. For the liberal person, and including myself, who relates more to ben adam lachaverai, that takes center stage. Not that I don't observe ritually, but
It's a matter of emphasis.
it's a matter of emphasis. So that's why I do feel there is an element of yes and no. And I would also add to what I said before, is that to me, the idea of Bamblechas Koyanim v'Goy Kaddish can be understood prescriptively and descriptively. A religious person is going to believe this 100% and going to believe that this is God's blueprint for the world, and therefore there's the mandate Kedoshim Tiyu, this is an absolute word of God. But there's also a descriptive approach, which is to understand that throughout the generations, because my ancestors believed this to be true, this was their mission. And they sanctified themselves based on that belief. So here is not the question of origin, but the question of result. What is the result? As a Jewish person, how do I view myself? How do I make the most of my Judaism?
That becomes like a tradition.
It is also traditionalism, but it's not just tradition.
That becomes how we as Jews do it.
Right. And therefore, it's not just like Mordechai Kaplan says, Jewish folkways, like dancing the hora, singing Hava Nagila, drinking borscht, eating bagels and lox. It's not just the custom eating knedlach and latkes. It is really a higher divine mission, which is religiously based. In other words, I believe very much that even a secular version of Judaism, or even a less orthodox Judaism, is, whether you like it or not, based on the religious conception of Judaism, of being a nation of priests, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. Even Reform Jews, or even completely secular Jews who are the warriors of social justice and tikkun olam, there may be secularizing a religious concept. But it begins from Kedoshim Tiyu. It begins for Goy Kaddish.
Yeah.
And therefore, again, what I'm trying to say is, unlike my previous paradigm where this is the truth, and there's a binary between truthhood and falsehood, this is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and other religions aren't. Today I can believe, and I do believe, that there are holy people of other faiths, and they also are able to approach God in their own way. And I believe there's a lot of value and perhaps truths in other religions as well. But the reason why I'm practiced Jewishly and I'm not interested in another form of practice is because this is my language. Yeah. And if someone's going to say that English is true and French is false, for example, or Hebrew is true and Yiddish is false, then you missed the boat.
Yeah.
The point is, this is your language. Now, I know this sounds heretical to a typical from point of view, but that's not this is where I am today.
Yeah.
This is what I've come to understand. I could be proven wrong, I could be mistaken, but based on my critical approach to scholarship, the idea of Jewishness as a form of national identity is a starting point. I infuse that with a religious consciousness. I would argue further that even secular Jews have essentially secularized a religious concept, a religious definition of Jewish nationalism, which is to be moral, to be holy, and they understand that to be their mandate. Because I'm also a religious person, I see value in religion and ritual observance, either as promoting holiness, like Shabbos, I think, is a great example of a day that is meant to focus on Chaye Olam, not Chaye Shah, on what is transcendent, what is eternal, not on what is temporal. But overall, and I also do many ritual mitzvahs because I think, and also part of the nationalism, let's say kosher. Rabbi Louis Jacobs spoke about the genetic fallacy. Genetic fallacy is, people say, well, it could be that kosher or laws of purity, laws of nida, let's say, emerge from primitive taboos. So it says, yes, maybe, as a critical scholar we think about it, but on the other hand, because as a nation, this is how we sanctify ourselves, so it can also be symbolic. In a certain sense, the chukim and the mishpatim can become eidos. What I mean by that is, there's a classic medieval classification of eidos, which are testimony, like mitzvahs that we do sukkahs, because God set us up in dwelling booths. And then there's mishpatim, let's say don't kill, which is natural morality. And then there is a chayk that we don't understand, like things that we don't understand. What I'm arguing is that even those mitzvahs that are chayk, which are either super rational or maybe they do originate from primitive taboos. As a Bible scholar, they end up as eidos. I'm doing it as bearing witness to tradition, to my people, to their idea of sanctification. I don't have to believe that God literally commanded Zachar Sema Shabbos L'Kachay to be part of the Am L'Kachay Shvi. I'm not saying that I don't believe it, but even if I'm not sure about it.
How does that get you to any kind of ispailos or any kind of dveikus? Or because it seems like, or does it not? In other words, does this get you to a kind of rapturous, religious, spiritual sense? Or is this just, this is how my nation does it, therefore I'm going to do it?
So first of all, there is, what we all know too well, the problems of this kind of nationalistic euphoria or collective effervescence that Emil Durkheim talks about, a sense of national identity. I don't want to turn nationalism into a getchka, into an avodah zarah, because I feel that the nationalism...
It could bring its own fervor, is what you're saying.
It could bring its own fervor.
Okay.
And also, well, what I'm trying to say is, perhaps unlike maybe what you were intimating before, yes, I do get ecstatic, I can listen to music and get involved in what may be termed a mystical experience on some level. But I think as a Jewish person, or as I've told you many times, for me, I feel a greater need and impulse to daven, to pray when I'm among my people than when I'm on my own. When I'm on my own, I'm an individual. I'm Yehuda Ber Zirkind. But it's when I'm with the tzibor, tzaddik and beinim and rishayim, when I feel the pulse of my people, that is where I feel I have an urge to pray. And even if I'm not going to daven every day, every tefillah, but when I'm walking into a shul and somebody's davening mincha, I'm going to join them. Usually, if I didn't daven, I'm going to join their mincha, their shachris. Why? Because it's about me. It's about makelas zirvos amcha beis Yisrael. Join the myriads of Jews. Hey, in Pipia, it's amcha beis Yisrael. Be together. I feel that I am that, and that also brings a certain degree of ecstasy. And I also believe that I'm not against individual ecstasy during prayer or meditation. There's room for that as an individual. And I also believe in generic religion, which is unrelated to any specific religion. It can be meditation. And I think as somebody who is a post-fundamentalist, I'm a little bit of a perennialist, meaning I believe there are truths in every religion and we're all trying to reach the divine. So I could appreciate a kind of non-institutionalized or even non-Jewish, non-specifically Jewish form of religious/spiritual expression in meditation, or even in being kind to other people in a moral way, even though that's not the ecstasy. But I think the Ratzoi also has to come with a shuv. The ascent also has to be grounded. The great spiritual soaring also has to land. I can't just live in the cave like Rashbi. Like Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, we're approaching like Goyver. We also have to live in this world. And Rashbi, when he was so intense, when he looked, according to the Talmudic Agoda, when he looked, he burnt everything in his wake. So this is where I feel that for me, there is a mission of belonging to the Jewish people, belonging to a collective form of religion and spirituality. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about nationalism, it's also that we have a mission, we have a role to play in the world. Whether it means that we're it, I'm not going there.
And there is some ability to lose one's own identity or one's own self-image, or to be subsumed, one's ego subsumed in that greater whole, which can lead to a unitive experience or a sense of ecstasy.
Yes, 100%.
I mean, you're not giving yourself up to God necessarily in some way, but you're giving up to the peoplehood, to the Jewish people, and by doing that, you end up giving yourself up to God, because Kadoshim Tiyu, very beautiful.
Right. For example, like let's say sometimes at the Koisel, at the Kotel, and I'm among hundreds or thousands of Jews praying. But let's say there's a moment of Birchas Koyanim. That is a moment. For me, that's a very strong divine moment. Like encounter with the divine. It's a very moment of deep biblical import in terms of the Birchas Koyanim, because the priestly blessing is written in the Torah. and it is a biblical blessing, but also because I connect to my people, I connect to tradition. And when I go to the Kaisel, I also feel that vertical and horizontal connection. I think that's key, because just peoplehood is only a horizontal connection. I'm connecting with my people.
Right.
And that is more secular.
But because it's the Jewish people which has in it the Torah,
Right.
which is connected with God, you end up with the vertical.
I believe that in order for us to sustain ourselves, in order for us to be a people that can justify our own existence to ourselves, let alone to the world, we need to live up to a higher moral mandate. And I think whether we like it or not, the world does expect of us to be Mamlechas Kohanim v'Goy Kodesh, whether we like it or not. But we do need to live up to that. And I think, again, I believe in nationalism, but not in an idol. In other words, the flag, just waving the flag is not what it's all about. It represents a moral duty. And again, what I'm saying is very typical, even in a broader Jewish sense. This doesn't necessarily have to be untraditional, even in the frum sense of being or lagoyim, mamlechas kohanim v'goy kodesh. It's just the particular manifestation or the emphasis that I place on nationalism as the Archimedean point for that. And I view religion as an extension of peoplehood, rather than religion as this truth that I know that Judaism is true and all the other religions are let's say, false from a fundamentalist point of view. So that's the base.
Very clear. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Sitting down again for another recorded conversation. A pleasure as always.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hospitality in your
Pleasure.
home.